America's one foot in the door of financial meltdown. February 6, 2018, 8 hours 24 minutes and 48 seconds. Source: NetEase Financial Integration. Author: Shui Pai of Financial Expert, Editor-in-Chief of the China Times. 2.7% is the critical point in the U.S. bond crisis that sent U.S. stocks down. At 2 p.m. on January 29, the yield on 10-year US Treasury bonds breached 2.7%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average started to plummet after the opening night, with the Dow down 530 points in 2 days, ending the overall trend of 50% gains since February 2016. The 10-year Treasury yield is the benchmark for U.S. financial assets, and a breakthrough of 2.7% represents the continuing evaporation of U.S. financial assets. Interest rate of 2.7% with a $20 trillion national debt scale. Computing interest is as high as $540 billion, and in 2017 the US economy is only 2.3%. Part of the economic growth has been debt interest aid outside $100 billion. So what does it mean for China to see a 2.7% rise in US debt? On June 1, 2015, the yield of US Treasury bonds rose by 2.5%. And after 15 days, all the A-shares fell sharply, and the stock market broke out completely. U.S. stocks plunged 16% in the same period. So why is the bond market contagion to the U.S. stock market when Treasury yields are close to 2.7%? That would be the biggest time bomb in the US bond market: junk. Junk bonds are also the most dangerous debt to borrow in the shale gas revolution, and the cost of raising funds for shale gas in the run-up to the Fed's rise is already 8%. As the Fed raises interest rates and yields rise, the cost of financing junk bonds downstream is rising. After more than 2.7% for hedge funds are selling junk bonds, causing panic selling, mass selling. FlangeCo, Ltd. In order to maintain liquidity in the market, liquidity will sell good quality assets. Continuous rising stocks can quickly to liquidate assets to the stock market and bond market crisis conduction. That is why a 2.7% rise in yields on Treasury bonds could lead to a fall in U.S. stocks. But more dangerous thing is that if the Fed can't stop us, bond yields continue to climb. Next level is 3%. Once close to 4%, the bond market and stock market sell-off will submerge the entire financial market. Black Thursday stock market crash will repeat itself. In America, it is not the financial crisis but similar to the economic crisis of 1929. So blood drinks say the United States is stepping into a financial market meltdown. Currently, U.S. financial market financing relies mainly on bond and stock markets. Bond yields are surging, and the social balance of U.S. GDP growth and pensions can only be supported by the rise of U.S. stocks. Once the stock market plunges, the financial operation of the entire American society will be paralyzed. This is something the United States can't afford and will never allow. But the stock market can't keep going up all the time. U.S. stocks have risen 56% since February 16, but the economy is growing at a pitiful 2.3%. That's not counting from 2008, when the U.S. economy grew by only 26%, but the stock market has risen 4.4 times. The blind can see that the American stock market has gone up, but the United States still has to support the U.S. stocks, and the burden is much stronger than the violent death. After all, it is better to live than to live. Why is the 10-year Treasury yield up 2.7%? The first reason is that the US debt market has been unconnected. Since the US started raising interest rates, China has reduced its holdings of $1 trillion in assets, and has withdrawn $300 billion from the US market alone. As the dollar strengthened, China stepped up its selling of US debt to the South in dollar terms. At the same time, we set up a negative list of overseas investment to combat underground banks and shadow banks, and shut down the Bitcoin exchange platform to prevent the transfer of black gold to the United States. These measures have played a big part. Of course, the biggest reason is the US financial has been increasing trend of solid QE to print out all the money into the financial virtual domain. Entity manufacturing is shrinking, the logo a lot, such as general corporate profits fell sharply. In the troubled northeastern United States, most of the shootings have taken place. The second reason is that Mr. Trump has spoken out against a trade war with China, provoking a backlash from China. From the threat of continuing to reduce U.S. debt to Degong's downgrade of U.S. sovereign credit, China is telling the United States that China will retaliate against a trade war with the United States. In its report, Daegong noted that the U.S. fiscal gap and maturing debt service pressure also forced its government debt to climb. Daegong expects fiscal 2018 and the 2019 fiscal year, the central government fiscal income on debt coverage rate of 14.9% and 14.2% respectively, to 12.1% in fiscal year 2022 get worse. The government will often face the pressure of raising the debt ceiling. In 2017 the US government to sell assets to the total debt coverage of 7.3%, unable to realize the effective payoff the debt. The government still had to rely heavily on debt monetization method to maintain source of repayment and liability of the appearance of balance, and the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates and shrink table brings higher financing costs will also increase in government debt rolling is difficult. The negative impact of tax cuts on the debt service of the central government will become more prominent. Government finances will continue to deteriorate, the debt burden will rise, and solvency will worsen. On behalf of the Chinese Central Bank, Daegong has been the most strident critic of U.S. debt. Summed up in 8 words: high debt, deficit spending. As U.S. debt, the largest foreign holder of China's position is in the calm water of the lake into a boulder, Treasury yields rise sharply, then this is the direct cause of rising Treasury yields. The world is full of interest, and the world is full of people. Blood drinks often say that the competition is ultimately for resources. This article will discuss the interaction between finance and geo-competition in detail. Still, with the 10-year Treasury yield as a benchmark, its changes are the most timely reflection of U.S. financial market volatility. The following are analyzed by the 2 vertices of the 10-year Treasury bond over the past 3 years. The first peak was between June 1, 2015 and November 1, 2015, with U.S. Treasury yields hitting 2.4% and 2.5%. And the dollar index overshot 100 to 100.36. The major geopolitical event in the same period is that the South China Sea arbitration initiated the first military confrontation between China and the US since the Taiwan Straits crisis. On October 1, 2015, Russia sent troops to Syria to quickly reverse the Syrian war. The second vertex is on December 12, 2016, 10-year Treasury yields above 2.5% to 2.5%. The dollar index through 100 to 103.64. At the same time a great event happened in geopolitics, that is the Syrian city of Aleppo in northern Syria Allied liberation. Russian troops captured in the Aleppo enclosed core, including the American Israel 128 Western Military Command Terrorist Operations Panel members. The loss of Aleppo has led to the formation of Turkey's anti-water and conflict zone. The U.S. Middle East strategy has suffered major setbacks, and the Middle East has been cut to the north and south. It should be pointed out that the U.S. Treasury yields soaring because they have in these 2 periods, September 9, 2016 and September 2017, number 3, in a nuclear test. With reference to a nuclear test, push-up yields surge directly, and 15 years at the end of the year and the end of 16 years in the United States launched a military threat to the DPRK are China and Russia. From the above, we have concluded the first rule: once the US geopolitical competition has suffered a serious setback, the US Treasury bond yields will explode, and the financial assets will evaporate. That is to say, the failure of the geo-hegemon will directly lead to the loss of American financial market. Every 1% increase in the yield of US Treasury bonds will evaporate US $680 billion in US financial assets. Second law: higher oil price leads to the rise of US Treasury bond yields, which leads to the downward trend of US bond yields. After the Russian invasion of Syria, the failure of the United States in Syria continued to expand, which directly led to the rise in oil prices, and the rise in oil prices coincided with the surge in US Treasury yields. Oil prices have more than doubled since October 1, 2015. In raising interest rates under the background of a stronger dollar, rising oil prices drive the central factory inflation picks up, direct drive to return to more than 50 Chinese and European PMI/PPI, Producer Price Index of Industrial Products, appeared positive growth. After rising inflation, the monetary policy of Central Europe gradually ended loose, and the capital of Central Europe stopped flowing out and began to flow in. US bond yields, which have lost international capital, began to rise. The third rule: the top 2 peaks of US Treasury yields have brought a sharp correction in US stocks and triggered a plunge in China's A-share market. On June 1, 2015, the yield reached 2.5%, which shocked the global stock market. On December 12, 2016, the yield of US Treasuries reached 2.64. After 15 days, the Chinese stock market collapsed from 3,600, and the investors lost a lot of money during the fuse. On January 12, 2018, a blood-drinking article suggested the stock market risk, and on January 29, the first day of trading on January 29, China's stock market began to fall. Before the Chinese stock market crash, blood drinks were issued on May 26, 2015 and December 28, 2016, to remind the stock market of the risks. Now the yield on US Treasuries is up 2.7%, and US stocks are plunging into shares, and that's the conclusion. People often say that the Chinese stock market's policy, in fact, China's regulators control the stock market up or down to see as the global capital market risk, especially focus on is the US market, and the 10-year Treasury jumped and the deterioration of the capital market is the external basis of regulatory control the stock market. In the dollar is the world's main reserve currency, and the United States, under the background of the capital market share of the world's largest, is also China's policy must be active defense, extrusion foam for China market to hit bottom. The two meetings of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Political Bureau of China stressed the importance of taking the financial services to the real economy. In this case, any bull market in financial markets is a departure from regulatory policy. The policy market does not look at the policy, finally can only hit the full head bag. The Treasury yields rose above 2.7% is different from the past. The dollar index has not, as before the 100 summit, has been pitifully fell to 89. This is unprecedented phenomenon, and the Fed has been raising interest rates 5 times, but America's financial situation is more and more loose. Claudio, chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements. This is a paradox, says Borio. The Federal Reserve to raise interest rates, but overall financial conditions more loose condition, leading to a standard indicators point to overall easy. In fact, this index has hit a 24-year low. This bizarre scene let Goldman Sachs could not help but question whether the Fed has lost control of the market. So has the Fed lost control of the market? The answer is yes, but America has a hard time. US financial conditions are becoming more and more relaxed, showing that domestic US dollar liquidity is abundant. Why is it abundant? Saying too many nouns will confuse the reader, but the answer is simple. US debt scale expands unceasingly. The dollar issued on the basis of US debt, the Obama era more than $9 trillion in US debt expansion, has now reached $20 trillion. The expansion of the US debt is equal to the dollar expansion. Continuous printing money. How can financial conditions more and more loose? From abroad, China after the end of the Fed's QE began large-scale foreign bottom. Total investment of more than $2 trillion, sell China dollar cash assets, increase the global supply of dollars, increase the supply of dollars through other countries. Part of Wall Street's debts into the United States, both inside and outside. Two trends converge. How can the United States is not more and more loose? The overall money supply keeps filling up. Can the dollar index not collapse? So much liquidity is sure to push up stocks, and it's not surprising that the US stocks that absorb a lot of liquidity are up in the sky. So the Fed's rise in interest rates and the so-called dollar strength is a hoax, and the Fed is calling for a rate rise to keep the US financial asset bubble from bursting. Throughout the financial scams, the Fed's book reading of the central bank masked the overall expansion of private financial institutions. His biggest buyers of US treasuries is actually the United States. When everyone watched shouted the Fed to raise interest rates to stop buying US debt and cut sheet, the Fed and a large number of other financial institutions led by buying US treasuries, and the Fed ordered to other banks and financial institutions shall not be sold prior to the expiry of the treasury, to avoid a slump in treasury yields. In fact, in October 2014, the Fed was just the central bank that stopped QE, and private financial institutions never stopped buying. To put it bluntly, this is what the Bank of America and private capital have combined to do. The play was good, but the effect was less obvious, with US Treasury yields rising 2.7% and dragging US stocks down. America is in financial trouble, and the key is in the Middle East. Oil prices will be controlled only if the Middle East's core area is reopened for oil dollars. Whether in cold damage control oil prices start output deflation or inflation super thermal damage, the United States to be able to strengthen the financial hegemony, complete financial plunder, through hot and cold damage in order to solve the problem of US debt profit time and space. To reopen the oil dollar valve would have to support Kurdish statehood to create an evil corridor and complete a turnaround in the Middle East. It is also the fundamental reason why the United States, at the expense of Turkey, a NATO ally, is to become a Kurdish state. It has been said that the failure of geo-competition will cause financial market turmoil and losses in the US. China has won a major geopolitical battle in the past 5 years, as the United States has been trying to turn its back on the Kurds. Let's take a look at the major geopolitical victories that China has achieved over the past 5 years and the huge financial benefits that have come from geopolitical victories. In February 2014, the Ukraine crisis broke out, and the United States joined European financial sanctions against Russia, leading Russia to move closer to China. In May 2014, China and Russia signed a $400 billion Eastern gas pipeline agreement, and China and Russia quickly moved closer to coordinate their interests in the Far East and Central Asia. In June 2014, the US Embassy in Kyrgyzstan closed down as a landmark event, representing China's victory in the geopolitical game in Central Asia, and working with Russia to drive the United States out of Central Asia. After Russia not only include the UN in foreign exchange reserves, and oil export and bilateral trade in UN, the issuance of RMB bonds, after signed a currency swap, the renminbi and the ruble also began to trade directly. Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and other countries began to accept Chinese investment, connivance in Russia, Central Asia not only energy development areas and the full liberalization of China, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan also with local currency settlement border trade with China. With the establishment of the SCO free trade area in the future, the RMB will become the main settlement currency of the SCO. In July 2015, the Iranian nuclear agreement, American sanctions against Iran for 36 years, since China and Pakistan to start building corridor, Pakistan and the United States, marked the West Asia region geopolitical game victory. Since Iran began large-scale oil exports, and the use of renminbi settlement, Iran sanctions be lifted, at the same time make it possible for the crude oil futures listed in Shanghai this year. Iran's support in the oil-rich emirate is indispensable. Pakistan, which announced the use of local currency in trade with Pakistan, has since deteriorated sharply. The construction of the China-Pakistan corridor marks the first step in the official exit of One Belt and One Road. The lifting of sanctions on Iran marks the full opening of China's One Belt and One Road South line into the Middle East. The blue line in the picture is the Middle East section of One Belt and One Road, the green is the HTS control of Idlib province, and the above yellow is the Avaline Kurdish, which is stuck on One Belt and One Road. In August 2016, China sent military advisory missions to Syria. In November 2016, the Russian and Syrian forces captured Aleppo and Turkey turned against water. Syria's anti-terrorist victory and Turkey's anti-water have opened a channel for China's One Belt and One Road South line into southern Europe. China has scored a preliminary victory in the geopolitical game between the core region of the Middle East and the Eurasian Union. Then in Turkey, led by the D8 within countries in bilateral trade settlement currency, add to that strategy, and with Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran's central line all the way to join area network construction. In July 2015, the South China Sea arbitration case was completed, and China, which completed the islands, won a game of Sino-South Korean Peninsula and Southeast Asian Games, which included much of Southeast Asia in the range of Chinese naval air forces. After that, the Philippines reversed the water, and the Central Bank of the Philippines included the UN in its foreign exchange reserves, and the dollar was breached by the RMB in the last bastion in Southeast Asia. The standoff ended in India's failure, with the United States and Israel trying to win over India. The victory after the confrontation between China and India, together with the China-Myanmar oil pipeline from the west to the Indo-China Peninsula, and the South China Sea victory together, jointly won the whole Southeast Asia. The utilization rate of RMB in Southeast Asian countries is further improved, and internationalization is accelerated. It should be pointed out that, in the railway construction in the future to Malaysia, China, and Thailand in the future China will cut off the connection of the Asia-Pacific strategy and the Middle East strategy, cut off America's 5th Fleet and Pacific 7th Fleet in the Indian Ocean, and cut off the Jewish capital group and the junction of American national interests. From the above we can see that China has achieved a geopolitical victory, which has brought huge economic and financial benefits. These countries sign currency swaps and bilateral trade currency settlements with China, so they are digging up the corner of dollar finance and trade settlement in these regions. The geopolitical victory supports China's trade and global expansion of the renminbi. There is no doubt that the geopolitical victory will lead to the expansion of financial and economic interests, which in turn will lead to financial and economic losses. This is the interaction between geography and finance. Here need to emphasize that China's economy and the expansion is totally different with the United States. China is a win-win mutual benefit for the purpose, not to seek to establish monetary hegemony, China bilateral trade and local currency settlement rather than pushing unilateral renminbi settlement. Combing the point in time, we can find China's geopolitical victory began. China-Russia strategic cooperation is established between China and Russia back toward the beginning of the time in June 2015 to October 2015. This time, China took the lead in the South China Sea. China and the United States military confrontation after complete control over the South China Sea in China. There is a major historical event in the middle of this period, which is the victory parade of the anti-Japanese war on September 3, 2015. China and Russia reaffirmed the maintenance of the post-war international order and raised the international moral standard. Less than a month after Putin returned to Syria, China and Russia launched a geostrategic response to the United States from the Asia-Pacific and the Middle East. A month later, China paid $15 billion for Russian troops in Syria. A year later, China sent military advisors to Syria, and China, which has been highly cautious in military cooperation, signed a military cooperation agreement with 3 Shiite countries. After the defeat of Aleppo, the Russian and Syrian forces have won successively, and so far Syrian government forces have controlled more than half of Syria's territory. Even Turkey is attacking areas. The Syrian troops also began full attack Iraq Hadley province HTS, scored after these 2 regions. The Middle East they fail, one belt and one road to southern Europe channel open in an all-round way. The Shiite pipeline, built with the help of Shiites, launched a full-scale currency war uprising with Shanghai crude oil futures. The image below shows the Turkish attack on Evelyn and the Russian and Syrian forces taking Idlib province. At the end of the article deduced the future direction of monetary policy under the Federal Reserve, in the case of a financial bubble without flange, be badly in need of a major geopolitical struggle victory in the United States, in order to comprehensive U.S. yields lower, the buffer space of monetary policy. Once the United States fails to do so, it will only be able to relaunch QE4 to quench its thirst, and then it will collapse, eventually leading the American economy into decline. Since Mr. Trump threatens China and South Korea, the US foreign military policy has become increasingly polarist and reckless. In this regard, China should be ready to fight in the military aspect. The financial sector, to continue in the geopolitical struggle victory area. Agriculture will gradually shift to the trade up on the Eurasian countries, will issue RMB from US debt to all the way along the country's growing area. With the completion of the cutting of the sinking Titanic, China will set sail and lead the world to a truly peaceful and stable prosperity. The Spring Festival is coming, and the new year is about to begin. In this way, the Waterskin expresses heartfelt thanks to all the supporters.